Maria Johnson adjusted her rearview mirror, taking in the familiar streets of Evergreen as her car hummed softly down Main Street. She hadn't been back in over a decade. The vibrant murals that once adorned the old library walls were faded, and the bustling corner stores had given way to a few boarded-up shops. Despite the changes, the heartbeat of the town remained, with people chatting outside the diner and kids riding bikes down the cracked sidewalks. For Maria, this was home, though it carried bittersweet memories. Today was her first day on the job as Evergreen's newly appointed police chief, a position she had fought hard to achieve. She had returned with a purpose, driven by the alarming news reports that had reached her in the city, racial tensions rising, allegations of misconduct in the police department, and a growing chasm between officers and the community. Maria knew the challenges ahead were immense, but she also knew that change had to start at the top. However, she hadn't announced her arrival publicly, opting instead for a low-profile start. The plan was simple: blend in, observe, and understand the depth of the issues before unveiling her authority. Dressed in plain jeans and a button-down shirt, Maria parked her car near the town square. She adjusted her baseball cap and pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll through emails as she leaned against the hood of her car. Her cover story was tight: a local woman visiting family. She had coordinated with the interim chief, who had agreed to keep her true identity under wraps for the first week. Maria wanted to experience what ordinary citizens face daily, unfiltered by the formalities of her rank. As she stood there, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing briefly before coming to a stop. Maria glanced up, her heart sinking slightly as she recognized the officer stepping out. Greg Harris. She'd reviewed his personnel file the night before: commendations for quick action during emergencies but a troubling number of civilian complaints for excessive force and unprofessional conduct. "Afternoon," Harris called out, his tone brusque as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a smugness that seemed etched into his features. "This your car?" "Yes," Maria replied evenly, slipping her phone into her pocket. "You parked a little too close to the hydrant," he said, pointing to the faded yellow curb. "Need to see your ID." Maria raised an eyebrow. "I'm pretty sure I'm within the legal distance." Harris's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm not here to argue. Let's see your ID." Maria felt a flicker of irritation but handed over her driver's license, careful to keep her demeanor calm. Harris studied it for a moment before glancing back at her. "What brings you to this part of town?" he asked, his tone carrying a subtle edge. "Just visiting family," Maria replied, keeping her answers short. Harris took a step closer, invading her personal space. "You from around here?" "I grew up here," Maria said, meeting his gaze steadily. He scoffed, flipping her ID back at her. "Doesn't mean you can park wherever you want. Move your car." Maria hesitated, sensing an opportunity to test his behavior further. "I don't see anyone else getting ticketed for parking violations," she said, nodding toward another car nearby that was much closer to the hydrant. Harris's eyes narrowed. "You have a problem, ma'am?" "Not at all," Maria replied. "Just pointing out the inconsistency." The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Without warning, Harris leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You're starting to annoy me," he said, his voice low and threatening. Then, to her shock, he spat on the ground, the act so deliberate and disrespectful that it made Maria's stomach churn. Maria froze, her mind racing. This was beyond unprofessional, it was an outright display of contempt and abuse of power. Every instinct told her to reveal her identity, to assert her authority and put Harris in his place. But she knew that if she acted rashly, she might lose the chance to uncover the deeper issues within the department. Instead, she took a deep breath, wiping her sleeve where the spit had narrowly missed. "Is this how you treat everyone?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Harris smirked. "Only people who don't follow the rules." Maria locked eyes with him, holding his gaze until he shifted uncomfortably. "I'll move my car," she said quietly, walking back to her vehicle. As she pulled away, Maria glanced in her rearview mirror, watching Harris return to his cruiser with the same smug confidence he had arrived with. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she processed what had just happened. This wasn't just about one bad officer. Harris's behavior was a symptom of a much larger problem. Maria drove to the precinct, her mind racing. Inside, she was greeted by a mix of familiar faces and new ones. The officers who had been with the department during her childhood smiled warmly, while the younger ones barely glanced up from their desks. She made her way to the interim chief's office, closing the door behind her. "We have a problem," she said, recounting the incident with Harris in detail. The interim chief, an older man named Captain Reynolds, sighed heavily. "Harris has been on my radar for a while," he admitted. "But he's slippery. Knows how to toe the line just enough to avoid serious consequences." "Not anymore," Maria said firmly. "We're going to handle this the right way. But first, I need to see the dashcam footage from his cruiser and any bodycam footage from today." Reynolds nodded, pulling up the files on his computer. As they reviewed the footage together, Maria's determination solidified. Harris's actions were appalling, but they were also an opportunity, a chance to show the department and the community that accountability was more than just a buzzword. That evening, Maria sat alone in her small apartment, reflecting on the day. Her cover had worked, but the encounter with Harris had left her shaken. She thought about the people in her community who didn't have her resilience or her platform. How many of them had endured similar treatment without any recourse? She knew the road ahead would be difficult. Exposing Harris was just the beginning. The real challenge would be addressing the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to thrive. But Maria was ready. This was her town, her community, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear it apart. As the sun set over Evergreen, casting long shadows across the streets, Maria made a sigh. Reynolds nodded, pulling up the files on his computer. As they reviewed the footage together, Maria's determination solidified. Harris's actions were appalling, but they were also an opportunity, a chance to show the department and the community that accountability was more than just a buzzword. That evening, Maria sat alone in her small apartment, reflecting on the day. Her cover had worked, but the encounter with Harris had left her shaken. She thought about the people in her community who didn't have her resilience or her platform. How many of them had endured similar treatment without any recourse? She knew the road ahead would be difficult. Exposing Harris was just the beginning. The real challenge would be addressing the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to thrive. But Maria was ready. This was her town, her community, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear it apart. As the sun set over Evergreen, casting long shadows across the streets, Maria made a sigh. Silent vow, change was coming. The morning sun crept through Maria's apartment blinds, casting streaks of golden light across the walls. She stirred awake, her mind already racing with thoughts of the previous day's encounter with Officer Harris. The memory of his smirk, the condescension in his tone, and the deliberate act of spitting lingered like a bad taste in her mouth. She was no stranger to confrontation, but something about this incident gnawed at her. Perhaps it was the sheer brazenness of it or the realization that others in the community likely endured worse without the power to push back. She arrived at the precinct early, blending in among the bustling activity as officers clocked in and prepared for their shifts. Wearing her plainclothes disguise once again, Maria positioned herself strategically near the coffee machine in the break room. She needed to gauge the culture of the department from the inside, and this was often where candid conversations happened. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, snippets of chatter began to fill the room. "Did you hear about Harris yesterday?" a younger officer asked, leaning casually against the counter. "Oh, what now?" his partner replied, rolling his eyes. "Apparently, he had some run-in with a woman near the square." "Typical Greg," acting like he owns the place. Spitting again, too. The younger officer chuckled nervously, as if unsure whether to disapprove or join in the laughter. Maria's stomach churned. Spitting again? This wasn't an isolated incident. She made a mental note to pull every complaint ever filed against Harris. Before she could slip away unnoticed, another voice joined the conversation. "Guy's got guts, I'll give him that," an older officer remarked, shaking his head. "But one of these days, it's going to bite him in the ass." Maria lingered a moment longer, listening as the group's laughter subsided and the room emptied. It was clear that while some officers disapproved of Harris's behavior, they weren't willing to challenge it openly. This was the culture she'd inherited, a toxic blend of fear, apathy, and complicity. Later that morning, Maria convened with Captain Reynolds in his office to review the department's complaint records. The stack of files he placed on the desk was thicker than she'd expected. "These are just the formal ones," Reynolds said grimly. "Plenty of folks in this town don't bother filing complaints because they don't believe anything will come of it." Maria flipped through the files, each one painting a damning picture of Harris's pattern of behavior. Excessive force during traffic stops. Harassment of young black men walking home at night. Dismissive treatment of domestic violence victims. And now, her own encounter. Each report was like a puzzle piece falling into place, revealing a larger, more insidious image. "What's the internal response been to these complaints?" Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mostly warnings and a couple of short suspensions. He's careful, though, nothing egregious enough to make it past the union lawyers. And he's got friends in high places." "Not anymore," Maria said firmly. "This ends now." Maria spent the rest of the day quietly gathering evidence. She reviewed body cam footage from Harris's previous shifts, noting every instance of misconduct. She interviewed officers who seemed willing to speak candidly, though most were hesitant to criticize their colleague directly. A picture began to emerge, not just of Harris's behavior but of a department that had allowed it to fester. By late afternoon, Maria's resolve was stronger than ever. She decided to test the waters further, putting herself in another vulnerable position to see how Harris would react. It wasn't a decision she made lightly, but she needed to understand just how deep his sense of entitlement ran. Around 5 p.m., Maria parked her car near a local park, this time deliberately ignoring a posted sign about restricted hours. She sat on a bench, pretending to read a book, while keeping an eye out for Harris's cruiser. Sure enough, within 15 minutes, he arrived, his headlights cutting through the early evening haze. Harris stepped out of the car with the same swagger he'd displayed the day before. Well, if it isn't my favorite rule-breaker," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maria looked up from her book, feigning surprise. "Is there a problem, officer?" "There sure is," Harris replied, crossing his arms. "Didn't you see the sign? This area's closed after 4:30. "I must have missed it," Maria said, standing up. "I'll leave now." "Oh, it's not that simple," Harris said, stepping closer. "You're trespassing. That's a citation, at the very least." Maria tilted her head, meeting his gaze with calm defiance. "I didn't mean any harm. Surely we can resolve this without a citation." Harris smirked, the same smug expression that had haunted her all night. "That depends. Are you going to give me trouble again, or are you finally going to show some respect?" Maria could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. She decided to push a little further. "Respect is earned, officer. Don't you think?" Harris's face darkened, and for a moment, Maria thought he might escalate the situation further. But then, something unexpected happened. Another police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing briefly before coming to a stop. Out stepped Officer Carla Mendez, one of the few women in the department and someone Maria had identified as a potential ally. "Everything okay here, Greg?" Mendez asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. Harris hesitated, glancing between Maria and Mendez. "Just dealing with a trespasser," he said, his voice losing some of its bravado. Mendez looked at Maria, then back at Harris. "Doesn't seem like she's causing any harm. Why don't we let her off with a warning?" Harris's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But next time, follow the rules," he said, his voice laced with irritation. As Maria walked back to her car, she caught Mendez's eye and gave her a small, appreciative nod. Mendez nodded back, her expression unreadable. That night, Maria sat in her apartment, replaying the day's events in her mind. Harris's arrogance was undeniable, but Mendez's intervention gave her a glimmer of hope. There were people within the department who wanted to do the right thing, they just needed someone to lead the way. Maria's phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Captain Reynolds, preliminary findings from today's review. "Harris isn't going to like what we've uncovered." Maria smiled grimly, her determination renewed. Tomorrow, she would take the next step in her plan. Harris's reign of unchecked power was coming to an end, and Maria was ready to ensure that the department, and the town, would never be the same again. The following morning, Maria stepped into the precinct with an air of quiet determination. Dressed in a more authoritative suit, she was done observing from the shadows. It was time to act. As she walked past the rows of desks, the usual hum of chatter and ringing phones seemed to dim. Officers glanced up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild confusion. Maria's presence was different today, commanding, purposeful. She approached Captain Reynolds's office, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Inside, Reynolds was hunched over his desk, poring over the stack of reports they had reviewed the day before. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with concern. "You sure about this?" he asked, motioning for her to close the door behind her. "Absolutely," Maria replied without hesitation. "The community deserves accountability, and it starts here." Reynolds nodded, though his shoulders sagged slightly. "I've been in this job long enough to know how messy this can get. But if anyone can handle it, it's you." Maria offered a faint smile before sitting across from him. "What's the latest on Harris?" Reynolds pushed a folder toward her. "We've confirmed multiple instances of misconduct that weren't properly documented. Body cam footage, eyewitness accounts, the works. But you know how this goes. He'll deny everything, and the union will protect him unless we build an airtight case." Maria flipped through the file, her mind racing. The evidence was damning, but she knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed to dig deeper. "I want to talk to Mendez," she said finally. "She stepped in yesterday, and I think she might be willing to speak up." Reynolds hesitated. "Mendez is a good officer, but she's cautious. She's kept her head down for a reason." "I'll handle it," Maria said firmly. "We need allies, and she could be one." Later that day, Maria found Mendez in the locker room, packing up her things after her shift. Mendez glanced up as Maria approached, her expression guarded. "Officer Mendez," Maria began, her tone calm but direct. "Do you have a moment?" Mendez nodded warily. "Sure. What's this about?" Maria gestured toward a bench, and they both sat down. "I wanted to thank you for stepping in yesterday. It meant a lot." Mendez shrugged. "Just doing my job." Maria leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I think you and I both know that not everyone in this department shares your definition of the job." Mendez's eyes flickered with something, perhaps recognition or guilt. "Look, I don't want trouble. I've got enough on my plate." "I understand," Maria said gently. "But trouble isn't going to stop just because we ignore it. Harris's behavior isn't just a liability for the department, it's a threat to this community. Mendez sighed, rubbing her temples. You don't think I know that? But calling him out. It's not that simple. He's got connections, and anyone who goes against him ends up on the wrong side of things. That's where I come in, Maria said, her voice steady. You're not alone anymore. I'm working to make sure that officers like Harris are held accountable, but I need people like you to help me. This department can't change if good officers stay silent. Mendez looked at Maria for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, she nodded. What do you need? Maria felt a surge of relief but kept her expression neutral. I need you to be honest with me. Tell me everything you've seen or heard about Harris, every incident, every conversation. Even the smallest detail could make a difference. Mendez hesitated before speaking, her voice low. There was an incident a few months ago. Harris pulled over a teenager, black kid, maybe 16. Claimed he was speeding, but I was on the scene, and the kid wasn't doing anything wrong. Harris got aggressive, searched the car without cause, and ended up arresting him for resisting. The kid's parents filed a complaint, but it went nowhere. Maria's jaw tightened. Why didn't you come forward? I tried, Mendez said, her voice tinged with frustration. But the higher-ups buried it. Said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue it. Maria nodded, her mind racing. This was exactly the kind of pattern she needed to expose. Thank you for telling me. I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug again. Over the next few days, Maria worked tirelessly, compiling a comprehensive case against Harris. She reviewed old complaints, interviewed more officers, and even reached out to community members who had been directly impacted by his actions. Each story painted a clearer picture of the harm Harris had caused, not just to individuals but to the fabric of trust between the department and the community. Meanwhile, Harris seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He continued to patrol the streets with his usual arrogance, confident that his position was untouchable. But Maria was patient. She knew the importance of timing, and she wasn't about to rush this. As the week drew to a close, Maria called for a mandatory meeting with the entire department. The room buzzed with speculation as officers filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Harris entered last, his usual smirk firmly in place. Maria stood at the front of the room, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice calm but commanding. As many of you know, I've spent the past week observing and assessing the state of our department. What I've seen has been eye-opening. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. I won't sugarcoat it, Maria continued. There are serious issues within this department that cannot be ignored. Issues of misconduct, abuse of power, and a culture that tolerates behavior that has no place in law enforcement. Harris shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering slightly. Maria's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Mendez, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new accountability measures, starting with a full review of all past complaints against our officers. Any pattern of misconduct will be addressed, and those responsible will be held accountable, regardless of rank or tenure. The tension in the room was palpable. Maria paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow. To that end, Officer Harris, I need you to step forward. Harris's eyes widened, and a murmur rippled through the room. He stood reluctantly, his smirk replaced by a scowl. What's this about? He demanded. Maria met his gaze head-on. This is about upholding the integrity of this department and restoring trust in our community. Officer Harris, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation into multiple allegations of misconduct. The room erupted into whispers and gasps as Harris stared at Maria, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. You can't do this, he spat. I've got rights. I've got connections. And I have evidence, Maria said firmly. You're welcome to contest the findings during the investigation, but for now, why the weight of her decision hit Maria the moment she stepped into her office. The sound of Harris's heavy footsteps leaving the precinct still echoed in her ears. She knew this wasn't the end, far from it. Harris's fury was only the beginning of the storm she'd unleashed. His allies within the department, his union connections, and even the bureaucracy of the justice system itself would be formidable barriers to real change. Still, Maria was resolute. She had taken the first crucial step, and now she had to see it through. Her phone buzzed on her desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Captain Reynolds. "We need to talk. Now." Maria sighed, already anticipating the conversation. She made her way to Reynolds's office, where she found him pacing behind his desk, a deep frown etched on his face. "Close the door," he said without looking up. Maria complied, folding her arms as she waited for him to speak. Reynolds finally stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've just started?" "I know exactly what I've started," Maria replied calmly. "And it's long overdue." Reynolds shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't disagree with you, but Harris isn't just some rogue officer. He's got people backing him, powerful people. The union's already breathing down my neck, claiming you violated protocol by calling him out in front of everyone." Maria's jaw tightened. "Protocol? How about the protocol for respecting the community we serve? Or the one for holding officers accountable for abuse of power?" Reynolds sighed heavily. "Maria, I'm on your side, but you need to understand how this works. Theory relieved of your duties." As Harris stormed out of the room, Maria turned back to the stunned officers. "Let this serve as a reminder, no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. This is just the beginning. Together, we will rebuild this department into something we can all be proud of." The room remained silent as Maria walked out, her heart pounding. She knew this was only the first step in a long battle, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and there was no turning back. System doesn't change overnight, and it doesn't take kindly to people trying to force it. Maria leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "I'm not trying to force anything, Captain. I'm doing what's right. If that ruffles some feathers, so be it." Reynolds studied her for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "All right. Just be careful. You've got a target on your back now, and Harris isn't the type to go down quietly." Maria left the office feeling both vindicated and burdened. Reynolds's warning was valid, but she couldn't afford to back down. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and community outreach. Maria made it a point to engage with local leaders, activists, and residents who had long felt alienated by the department. She wanted them to know that change was coming, even if it was slow and painful. One evening, as Maria was wrapping up her notes for the day, Mendez knocked on her door. She stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Got a minute?" Mendez asked. "Of course," Maria replied, gesturing for her to sit. Mendez hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about speaking up, making a difference. And I want to help." Maria smiled, sensing the inner conflict Mendez was grappling with. "That means a lot, Carla. But I need you to be sure. Once you step forward, there's no turning back." Mendez nodded slowly. "I've stayed quiet for too long. Harris and others like him, they've poisoned this department. It's time for someone to stand up to them." Maria leaned forward, her expression serious. "All right. If you're ready, I need you to testify during the internal review. Share everything you've witnessed. It won't be easy, but your voice could make a huge difference." Mendez exhaled deeply but nodded. "I'll do it." In the days leading up to Harris's formal hearing, Maria noticed a shift in the precinct's atmosphere. Some officers seemed supportive, offering her subtle nods of encouragement or quick smiles. Others were openly hostile, muttering under their breath as she passed by. She knew the department was divided, and Harris's impending review had become the flashpoint. The day of the hearing arrived, and the conference room was packed. Representatives from the union sat on one side, their expressions stern and unyielding. Harris himself was there, his face a mask of indignation. Maria sat at the head of the table, flanked by Captain Reynolds and a representative from the city's Civilian Oversight Committee. The proceedings began with a review of the evidence Maria had painstakingly compiled. Bodycam footage, written complaints, and witness testimonies painted a damning picture of Harris's conduct. As each piece of evidence was presented, Maria watched Harris's expression shift from smug confidence to barely contained rage. When it was Mendez's turn to testify, the room grew tense. She spoke clearly and calmly, recounting multiple incidents where Harris had crossed the line. Her testimony was powerful, not just because of its content but because of her courage in delivering it. Maria could see the impact it had on the room. Some officers looked uncomfortable, while others appeared emboldened. Harris, however, was not one to go down without a fight. When it was his turn to speak, he launched into a tirade about how he was being targeted unfairly, claiming that his actions had always been within the bounds of his duties. "This is a witch hunt," he declared, his voice rising. "I've served this community for years, and this is the thanks I get? Being dragged through the mud by people who don't understand what it takes to do this job?" Maria met his gaze evenly. "Serving the community doesn't give you a free pass to abuse your authority, Officer Harris. Accountability is not persecution. It's justice." The hearing concluded with the Oversight Committee announcing that Harris would face disciplinary action, including termination and potential legal proceedings. The decision sent shockwaves through the precinct, but Maria knew it was only the beginning. As the weeks went on, the ripple effects of Harris's downfall became apparent. Other officers began coming forward with their own accounts of misconduct they had witnessed or experienced. The department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and community engagement. Maria worked closely with local leaders to rebuild trust, holding town hall meetings and creating channels for residents to voice their concerns. For Maria, the journey was far from over. The systemic issues that had allowed Harris to thrive would take years to dismantle, but she was committed to the fight. And as she walked through the precinct each day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a police chief, she was a catalyst for change. One evening, as Maria was leaving her office, Mendez stopped her in the hallway. "I just wanted to say, thank you," Mendez said, her voice sincere. "For everything." Maria smiled, resting a hand on Mendez's shoulder. "Thank you for having the courage to speak up. We're in this together." As Maria stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Change was slow and often painful, but it was possible. And in this small town, it had finally begun. The aftermath of the disciplinary hearing was a whirlwind of emotions and consequences, both within the precinct and in the larger community. The removal of Officer Harris sent a clear message that accountability would no longer be an optional virtue but a mandatory standard. While some celebrated the decision, others resisted, unwilling to accept that the tides were turning. Maria quickly became a focal point in both the department and the town. The media caught wind of the events, and reporters flooded the precinct, asking for statements, interviews, and clarity about what had transpired. Maria's response was carefully measured. She stood on the steps of the station one morning, facing a crowd of journalists and community members, her voice steady and firm. "This is not just about one officer or one incident," she began. "This is about creating a culture of accountability and trust. The actions we've taken are a first step toward rebuilding the relationship between law enforcement and the people we serve. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but change starts here." Her words echoed through news outlets and social media, sparking both support and backlash. Maria was hailed as a hero by some and vilified by others who viewed her actions as a betrayal of the department's so-called camaraderie. The backlash, however, only strengthened her resolve. She knew the fight for reform was as much about persistence as it was about courage. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of hope and resistance. Some officers rallied around Maria, inspired by her boldness and determination. Others whispered in hushed tones, their resentment palpable. One afternoon, Maria entered the break room and found a group of officers huddled together, their conversation halting the moment she walked in. "Don't stop on my account," she said evenly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran named Dobbs, finally spoke up. "Chief, it's not personal, but some of us think you're making it hard to do our jobs." Maria turned to face him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Dobbs, what makes the job hard isn't accountability, it's the lack of trust from the community. When officers abuse their power, it undermines all the good work the rest of us do. If we want to be effective, we need to earn that trust back." Dobbs grumbled something under his breath, but Maria didn't press further. She knew that changing minds would take time, and actions would speak louder than words. Meanwhile, Maria's efforts to connect with the community were met with mixed reactions. At a town hall meeting, residents packed into the local community center, their faces a blend of hope and skepticism. Maria stood at the front of the room, addressing their concerns with honesty and humility. "I can't undo the harm that's been done," she admitted. "But I can promise you this, we're committed to making things right. We've started implementing new policies to ensure transparency and fairness, and we're working on creating partnerships with community organizations to bridge the gap between us. This is your police department, and your voices matter." One woman stood up, her arms crossed. "And what about officers like Harris? How many more of them are still on the force?" Maria nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. "We're conducting a thorough review of all past complaints and records. Anyone found to have violated their oath will be held accountable, just as Harris was. But we can't do this alone. If you have concerns or information, please come forward. Together, we can make this department what it's supposed to be." The room erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. Maria could see the doubt in some eyes and the flicker of hope in others. It was a start. Back at the precinct, the ripple effects of Harris's removal continued to unfold. Mendez, emboldened by her role in exposing Harris, began to step into a leadership role herself. She organized workshops on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics, inviting community leaders to participate. The sessions were tense at first, with officers bristling at the idea of being lectured by civilians. But gradually, walls began to come down. One memorable moment occurred during a session led by a local pastor who spoke about his own experiences with racial profiling. An officer named Martinez, who had been quiet and defensive throughout, raised his hand. "I never thought about how some of my actions might be seen as intimidating," he admitted. I thought I was doing my job. But I see now that perception matters as much as intention." The pastor smiled warmly. "Acknowledging that is the first step, Officer Martinez. Change doesn't happen all at once, but every step counts." Maria watched from the back of the room, a swell of pride and hope rising in her chest. These moments, though small, were the building blocks of transformation. But not everyone was willing to embrace the change. Harris, now officially terminated, had begun to rally his supporters, both within the department and the community. He painted himself as a victim of a political agenda, claiming that Maria's actions were more about optics than justice. His rhetoric gained traction among a faction of officers and residents who viewed the reforms as an attack on tradition. One evening, Maria received an anonymous tip about a meeting being held by Harris and his allies. The informant warned that Harris was planning to challenge her leadership, accusing her of undermining the department's morale and effectiveness. Maria debated whether to confront the situation head-on or let it play out, but ultimately, she decided transparency was her best weapon. The next day, she called a department-wide meeting. Standing at the front of the room, she addressed the growing divide. "I'm aware that not everyone agrees with the direction we're taking," she began. "And that's okay. Change is never easy, and it's natural to feel conflicted. But let me be clear, the changes we're making are not about politics or personal vendettas. They're about creating a department that serves everyone with fairness and respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If you have concerns, bring them to me. Let's have those conversations. But if you're working against this mission, if you're trying to undermine the progress we're making, then you're not just opposing me. You're opposing the values this department stands for." The room was silent. Maria scanned the faces before her, searching for any sign of dissent or support. Mendez gave her a subtle nod, and a few other officers followed suit. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. As the weeks turned into months, the department began to shift. The old guard, resistant to change, either adapted or moved on. New recruits were carefully vetted, chosen for their commitment to community-oriented policing. The town itself started to heal, slowly but surely. Maria's efforts to rebuild trust were paying off, and the department was becoming a symbol of hope rather than fear. One evening, as Maria walked through the town square, she overheard a group of teenagers talking about her. "She's tough, but she's fair," one of them said. "I think she's actually trying to make things better." Maria smiled to herself, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. She knew the journey was far from over, but moments like these reminded her why she had taken on this fight. The transformation of the department was not just about policies or personnel, it was about redefining what it meant to serve and protect. And though the road ahead was still fraught with challenges, Maria was ready to face them, knowing that every step forward brought her closer to the vision of justice and integrity she had always believed in. The weeks following Harris's termination were marked by an uneasy quiet. While some officers embraced the changes Maria was implementing, others seethed silently, unwilling to openly confront her yet. Harris's departure was a seismic event, but it had not eradicated the deeply rooted issues within the department. For Maria, every day brought new challenges and more reminders of how entrenched the resistance to reform could be. Yet, she persisted, determined to see her vision through. The precinct became a microcosm of the community it served, a place where battle lines between progress and tradition were subtly drawn. On one hand, there were officers like Mendez, whose resolve to stand for justice had strengthened since testifying against Harris. She had begun mentoring younger recruits, emphasizing empathy and the importance of building trust with the public. On the other hand, there were still whispers of discontent from officers who resented Maria's leadership and the changes she represented. One morning, as Maria walked through the precinct, she noticed an unusual tension in the air. Officers clustered in groups, their conversations halting as she passed. She caught snippets of words: petition, unfair, overreach, but no one confronted her directly. Later that day, Captain Reynolds walked into her office, a grim expression on his face. "We've got a problem," he said, dropping a stack of papers onto her desk. Maria picked up the papers and quickly scanned them. It was a petition signed by nearly a third of the department, calling for an independent review of her leadership and decisions. The petition accused her of creating division, undermining morale, and pursuing a personal agenda at the expense of the department's integrity. Maria set the papers down, her expression unreadable. "How many signatures?" she asked. 57, Reynolds replied. "Mostly from Harris's old crew, but a few others have joined in." They're calling it a vote of no confidence. Maria leaned back in her chair, considering her response. And what's your take on this, Captain? Reynolds hesitated before answering. It's a power play. Harris might be gone, but his influence isn't. This is their way of testing you, seeing if they can push back without outright defying you. Maria nodded slowly. Let them test me. I'm not backing down. Over the next few days, the petition became a point of contention within the department. Some officers who had initially signed it quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to jeopardize their careers. Others doubled down, emboldened by the collective action. Maria responded with unwavering composure, continuing to push forward with her reforms while addressing the petition head-on. At a department-wide meeting, Maria stood before her officers, the petition in hand. She looked out at the room, her gaze steady. I've read your concerns, she began. And while I may not agree with all of them, I respect your right to voice them. This department should be a place where everyone feels heard, even when we disagree. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. That said, let me be clear, the changes we're making are not negotiable. Accountability, transparency, and community trust are not optional, they're essential. If you believe that makes me unfit to lead, I won't stop you from pursuing this petition further. But know this, leadership isn't about being popular. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then Mendez stood, her voice firm and clear. I support Chief Alvarez. She's the first leader we've had in years who's actually fighting to make things better, for us and the community. A few other officers murmured their agreement, and slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. While not everyone was swayed, Maria's speech planted a seed of doubt among her detractors. The petition lost momentum, and its backers retreated, though Maria knew they would not give up entirely. Meanwhile, Maria continued her outreach efforts, meeting with community leaders and activists to address their concerns. She launched a new program called Bridging the Gap, which paired officers with local residents to foster dialogue and mutual understanding. The program was met with skepticism at first, but over time, it began to yield results. One of the most impactful moments came during a session where an officer named Peterson was paired with a young man named Jamal, who had been unfairly detained by the police 2 years earlier. Their initial meeting was tense, with Jamal openly expressing his distrust of law enforcement. You don't know what it's like, Jamal said, his voice filled with frustration. Every time I see a cop, I wonder if today's the day I'll get stopped for no reason. You get to wear that badge and go home feeling safe. I don't. Peterson, a middle-aged officer with 2 decades on the force, listened intently. For the first time, he began to see policing from a perspective he had never considered. You're right, he admitted. I don't know what that's like. But I want to understand. I want to do better. By the end of the program, Peterson and Jamal had developed a mutual respect, and their story became a powerful example of what could be achieved when both sides were willing to listen and learn. Maria highlighted their experience in a town hall meeting, using it as a beacon of hope for the future. Despite these successes, the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. Maria received anonymous threats, warning her to back off or face the consequences. One particularly chilling letter arrived at her home, containing nothing but a single word, quit. Maria reported the threats to the authorities but refused to be intimidated. She increased her personal security and doubled down on her efforts, knowing that fear was exactly what her adversaries wanted to instill. As the months passed, the department began to transform. Officers who had resisted change either adapted or left, replaced by recruits who embraced Maria's vision. Community trust, while still fragile, was slowly being rebuilt. Maria's initiatives gained recognition beyond the town, drawing praise from state officials and law enforcement leaders who saw her as a pioneer in modern policing. But the true measure of Maria's impact came one quiet afternoon, when an elderly woman approached her in the town square. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Jenkins, grasped Maria's hand tightly. "I've lived here for 60 years, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And for the first time, I feel like someone's actually listening. Thank you." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Moments like these reminded her why she had taken on this fight. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And as she walked back to the precinct, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, leading the charge for justice, one step at a time. The months following the upheaval within the department marked a transformative period for both Maria and the town she served. What began as a battle for justice and accountability had blossomed into a movement that transcended the precinct. Maria's resolve had inspired others to reimagine what law enforcement could be, but the journey was far from over. With every step forward came new challenges, new tests of her leadership, and new stakes for the community that was watching her every move. One late autumn morning, Maria sat at her desk, reviewing reports from the precinct's new oversight committee. The committee, made up of both officers and civilian representatives, had been one of her most controversial reforms. Many within the department had resisted the idea of outsiders evaluating their actions, but Maria stood firm, knowing that transparency was key to rebuilding trust. The report detailed the progress of various initiatives, including de-escalation training, community outreach programs, and the revamped complaint review process. There were clear signs of improvement. Complaints of misconduct had dropped by 40%, and community satisfaction surveys showed a noticeable increase in trust. Yet, Maria couldn't ignore the lingering resistance from a small but vocal faction within the department. They operated quietly, undermining her efforts whenever they could, and Maria knew they were waiting for her to slip. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mendez, who entered her office with a serious expression. "Chief, we've got a situation," she said, closing the door behind her. "There's been an incident at the high school. A fight broke out between two students, and it escalated when one of our officers intervened. Parents are already calling, and the media's on its way." Maria felt a familiar knot of tension in her stomach. "What happened?" Mendez hesitated. "The officer used force to restrain one of the students, a 15-year-old boy. Witnesses are saying it was excessive. There's cell phone footage circulating online, and it doesn't look good." Maria stood, her mind racing. "Who's the officer?" "Dobbs," Mendez replied, her tone heavy. Maria's heart sank. Dobbs had always been one of the more outspoken critics of her reforms. He had a history of pushing boundaries, though nothing that had yet crossed the line into outright misconduct, until now. "Where is he?" Maria asked. "In the break room. He's refusing to speak to anyone until his union rep gets here." Maria nodded, already formulating a plan. "Get the oversight committee on this immediately. I want a full review of the footage, witness statements, and Dobbs's account. And contact the boy's family. I'll meet with them personally." Within hours, the incident had become the top story on every local news channel. The footage showed Dobbs grabbing the student by the collar and forcing him to the ground while shouting orders. The student's cries and the reactions of bystanders painted a grim picture. Maria knew this would be a defining moment for her leadership. How she handled the situation would either solidify the progress they had made or undo it entirely. That evening, Maria met with the boys' parents at their home. They were understandably angry and distraught, their son nursing bruises and a deep sense of humiliation. Maria listened to their concerns without interruption, acknowledging the pain they felt. When they finished, she spoke with sincerity. "I can't undo what happened," she said, her voice steady. "But I promise you this, we will get to the bottom of this, and we will hold the officer accountable if he's found to have acted improperly. Your son deserves justice, and so does this community." The parents were skeptical but agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Maria left their home feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Back at the precinct, the oversight committee was already hard at work. The footage was reviewed frame by frame, and statements were collected from everyone involved. By the end of the week, the findings were clear. Dobbs had used excessive force, violating both department policy and the principles Maria had fought to instill. The decision to discipline Dobbs was met with fierce backlash from his supporters within the department. They accused Maria of scapegoating him to appease the public, framing the issue as a referendum on her entire reform agenda. Dobbs himself went on record, claiming that his actions had been justified and that he was being unfairly targeted. Maria held a press conference to address the incident, her tone measured but firm. "This is not about one officer," she said. "It's about ensuring that every member of this department upholds the highest standards of conduct. Officer Dobbs's actions do not reflect the values we are striving to build, and he will be held accountable. This is what accountability looks like, not for show, but because it's what justice demands." The fallout was immediate and intense. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with some supporting Maria's decision and others demanding her resignation. Social media buzzed with debates, dividing the town even further. Maria felt the strain of it all, but she refused to back down. She knew that meaningful change was never without cost. Amid the chaos, Maria received an unexpected visit from a retired officer named Gerald Price, who had served as chief decades earlier. Price was a revered figure in the town, known for his wisdom and fairness. He had been watching Maria's journey from afar and had come to offer his perspective. "You're doing something most people wouldn't dare to do," Price said, his voice filled with admiration. "But remember, leadership isn't just about making the tough calls. It's about finding a way to bring people along with you, even the ones who resist." Maria nodded, absorbing his words. "I'm trying, but sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." "It won't be," Price replied with a wry smile. "Not for everyone. But if you stay true to your principles and keep moving forward, the people who matter will see that. And that's how real change happens." Inspired by Price's wisdom, Maria redoubled her efforts to bridge the growing divide. She organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting both supporters and critics to voice their opinions. She met privately with officers who had opposed her, seeking to understand their concerns and find common ground. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The high school incident, once a flashpoint of controversy, became a catalyst for deeper conversations about the role of law enforcement in the community. Maria worked with educators, parents, and students to develop new protocols for handling conflicts in schools, ensuring that officers were trained in de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. The program, named Safe Spaces, became a model for other towns grappling with similar issues. By the end of the year, the department had undergone a profound transformation. The officers who remained were those who believed in Maria's vision, and new recruits brought fresh energy and perspectives. The town, while still grappling with its past, had begun to heal, its residents slowly rebuilding their faith in the people sworn to protect them. On a crisp winter morning, Maria stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Community Awards ceremony. She had been invited to speak, and as she looked out at the crowd, she felt a surge of emotion. This was not the same town she had walked into months ago, it was a town on the cusp of something better. "I came here with a simple goal," Maria began. "To serve and protect. But what I've learned is that those words mean so much more than enforcing laws. They mean building trust, listening to each other, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. We're not perfect, and we still have a long way to go. But together, we've shown that change is possible." The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of peace. The journey had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the power of courage, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice.